Welcome back to another read aloud of Lemony Snicket's file under 13 Suspicious Incidents. Yesterday we finished the chapter that was called Violent Butcher, and I will be posting the solution to that chapter on the chapter 7 quiz post. So today we're going to read chapter 8, and chapter 8 is called 12 or 13. No, it's 8. But 12 or 13. Lemony Snicket, said Moxie Malahan. She was talking to me. Do you want to see something funny? It was an ordinary day, and Moxie had found me sitting on the lawn in front of one of Stained by the Sea's most impressive buildings, looking at a large object. The building had once been City Hall and was now a library in one half and a police station in the other. The lawn had once been pretty, but was now scraggly, and the large object I was looking at had once been an enormous statue and was now a metal lump, following a suspicious explosion some years previous. The explosion and the lump were part of my biggest case, and on some ordinary days I liked to sit and look at the statue's remains, hoping that a new clue would drop upon me. So far, the only thing to drop upon me had been an acorn. An acorn was not a clue for anything, as far as I could tell. Something funny seemed like it could be a nice break. What kind of funny? I asked her. Funny like a clown on stage, or funny like a clown hanging around the entrance to a bank? The bank one. Moxie sat down next to me and opened her typewriter case with a click. What's the news, Moxie? I was in the archives of the Stained Lighthouse, she told me, looking through the articles my mother wrote when she was still a reporter in town. I bet she was a good one, I said, if her daughter is any indication. I like to think I developed some of my journalism skills on my own, Moxie said. I'm sure she'll be very proud when she sees you again. She handed me an envelope. In the meantime, take a look. I don't see anything funny about an envelope, I said. Moxie took off her hat and rolled her eyes. And I don't see anything funny about that remark, she said. Why don't you look inside the envelope? Good idea, I said, but when I slid the crumpled newspaper article into my hands, I still didn't see anything funny. Tepid turnout for Frome race, I read out loud. Only a dozen sledders competed in this year's race down Homily Hill for the Ethan Frome Festival. Organizers said attendance at the auction was also a disappointment, despite such distinguished items as an oil painting of Gary Dorian, Stained by the Sea's famed cosmetician. Hot cider sales were also low. Complete story on page 34. There wasn't any more to it, so I turned my eyes to Moxie and shrugged. Don't shrug at me, Snicket. I shrug when there's something to shrug about, I explained. I'm sorry it's not a very interesting article, but it's not your mother's fault. It sounds like the Ethan Frome Festival wasn't very interesting. You're wrong there, Moxie said, her voice a little wistful. The Ethan Frome Festival was once a wondrous event in Stained by the Sea. Every winter there would be a large auction where the people would bid large sums of money on various items, and all the money would be donated to the library. After the auction, there would be a competitive sled race down to the bottom of the hill, where the fastest sledder would win a medal and a very handsome fountain pen provided by Ink Inc. But when the ink industry began to fade, the festival got smaller and smaller until they canceled it altogether. That's a sad story, I said, but I don't see much funny about it. Take another look. Tepid turnout. Another look, Snicket, not another read. My eye moved to the photograph which accompanied the article. It wasn't a very good photograph, and it was made worse by the fading, shriveled paper on which it was printed. Looks like tough sledding, I said. Lots of trees and rocks, unless those are just ink smudges. The Stained Lighthouse never smudged, Moxie says sternly, and it's not the landscape I noticed, it's the sledders. This photograph was taken from the top of Homily Hill, I said. The sledders looked like little bugs in the snow. How many bugs? I looked at the photograph again, and then I looked at it again once more. Then I looked at Moxie. I knew you'd catch on eventually, she told me. I count 13. So do I, Moxie said, taking the newspaper, and the article says a dozen. Well, somebody miscounted. My mother was a very good journalist, Moxie said. If she said there were a dozen sledders competing in the race, that's how many there were. It is useless to argue with someone about their mother. Even if you win the argument, you feel like a scoundrel. Well, then perhaps someone just happened to be sledding down the same hill, I said. Someone who wasn't competing. That doesn't seem very likely. If you like sledding, why wouldn't you participate in the race? I don't know why anyone likes sledding in the first place, I said. Life goes downhill enough without speeding the process along. Was there a referee, perhaps? There was no referee. Another photographer, then, getting pictures of the racers close up? At the time this article appeared, the stained lighthouse had only one photographer. A rock that happened to be shaped like a sledder? Moxie gave this last guess of mine the glare it deserved. I was hoping a pair of fresh eyes would solve this mystery, she said. I've been staring at this photograph for quite some time trying to figure it out. Fresh eyes might not be enough for figuring, I said. We need more to go on than an old photograph. The rest of the article would be helpful. Where's page 34? Moxie shook her head. I searched the archives for hours, but page 34 is nowhere to be found. Do you mind if I ask you why you're investigating this particular mystery? I said, looking back at the ruined statue. I don't have to remind you that we have quite a bit of pressing business to attend to. Of course you don't have to remind me, Snicket, Moxie said. I was investigating our big case, but I got distracted by this other crime. I don't know if you can call a mysterious photograph of sledders a crime, I said. It's more like a curiosity. Well, I got curious about a theft that was committed on the day of the festival, Moxie said, and then I thought the photograph might be a clue. Theft, I asked. What was stolen? An oil painting of Stained by the Sea's famed cosmetician, Moxie said. Gary Dorian, I said. That portrait was one of the auction's most distinguished items. I already know you read the article about the festival, Moxie said with a smile, opening her typewriter case again, but there was an article about the theft in the next day's edition. She produced another envelope, and the envelope produced another scrap of newsprint. The painting disappeared during the sled race, but was found late that night in the home of Chase B. Willow. Who's Chase B. Willow? He worked for Ink Inc. as a needle operator in the ink wells, needling ink out of the octopi. I shivered a little. The giant needle machines extracting ink from the frightened octopi hiding down deep in wells were something that always made me uneasy from the first time I saw the devices on my way into town. Why would a needle operator steal a painting? Mr. Willow always maintained his innocence, Moxie said, using a phrase which here means said he didn't do it, and she looked down at the second article. I'm a happily married man, Mr. Willow told reporters as police led him out of his house. I have absolutely no interest in cosmeticians. Despite these protests, Mr. Willow was arrested and charged with the theft of the painting, which the officers found in Mr. and Mrs. Willow's attic in what was described as more or less plain sight leaning against an antique headboard. Were the officers the Mitchums? I asked, thinking of Stained by the Sea's only police officers. I'm surprised they found the painting. Frankly, I'm surprised they found the attic. It wasn't the Mitchums, Moxie said. It says here it was the officers Durham. Stained by the Sea had a whole police squad back then. So the Durhams arrested Mr. Willow? They did more than arrest him, Moxie said. They arrested him and put him on trial, and when he was found guilty, they shipped him off to prison in the city. He's still there. A prison term seems fair punishment for someone who stole a valuable painting. I agree, Moxie said, but I don't think Mr. Willow committed the crime. Were the Durhams corrupt? The Durhams were two of the bravest and most honest women in Stained by the Sea. If they arrested Mr. Willow, they thought he was guilty. He must have looked pretty guilty if the painting was found in his attic, I said, and his excuse about being married doesn't make much sense. His alibi doesn't make much sense either, Moxie said. Where did Mr. Willow say he was while the painting was stolen? I asked. The whole town knew where he was, Moxie said. He was winning a medal and a very handsome fountain pen. Chase B. Willow won the sled race at the Ethan Frome Festival that year. The police deduced that he stole the painting, sledding down the hill with it, and hid it in his attic. That night, he had a party celebrating his victory and invited several of his friends in the police force. During a game of hide and seek, they found the painting in the attic. What kind of thief, I asked, invites police officers to his home where he has hidden a stolen item? And what kind of thief, Moxie asked, tries to win a sledding contest in the middle of a crime? It would be difficult enough to hide a stolen painting on a sled going downhill, I agreed, without everyone watching you win a medal and a fountain pen. Nevertheless, Mr. Willow was found guilty and sent to prison, Moxie said. The portrait of Gary Dorian was auctioned off the following year. The festival continued to decline, and Willow's wife divorced her imprisoned husband and moved in with a lawnmower technician. The whole story was more or less forgotten until I stumbled upon it in these archives. What else about the crime is in those archives? I'm putting together a file, Moxie said, but it's taken a while. The Lighthouse archives are really in a shambles. There are articles and photographs everywhere. Photographs, I said. Of course, Moxie said. When you see a picture in a newspaper, it's just one of dozens the photographer has taken that day. The editors print their favorite one and the rest are filed away. Let's go, I said. To the archives? To the archives, I told her, and to the archives we went. The archives of the archives of the Stained Lighthouse lived in a lighthouse that had once served as the newspaper office and a beacon for ships at sea and now just served as the Malahan home. It was a bit of a walk from where Moxie had found me, and the journalist and I wound our way through the deserted streets of Stained by the Sea and then up a curvy road that led to the lighthouse. We passed rows of uninhabited houses with broken windows and overgrown lawns, and I found myself wondering how much work a lawnmower technician would have in a town like Stained by the Sea, which seemed to grow wilder and more untamed each day. You know where the archives are, Moxie said, gesturing to the spiral staircase as we stepped inside the lighthouse. I'll meet you up there after I pour us some limeade and check on my father. Give him my regards, I said. I will if he's awake, she said, and ducked into the kitchen while I climbed up the stairs. I'd visited the archives of Stained Lighthouse before, and it was always a tiresome task. There were files and stacks of paper every place, sometimes very organized and sometimes not at all. If you opened the windows, the breeze tended to blow papers around and make your job worse, but if you kept them closed, the room was so stuffy you wanted to take a nap. I probably needed a nap, but didn't want to take one, like almost everyone I knew. There was a large flat desk where Moxie had been working, and I sat there and looked through the papers she had assembled until I found a sheaf of photographs taken during the Ethan Frome Festival 3 years previously. By the time Moxie came in with the limeade and tall, frosted glasses, I was frowning at a photo of a large, smiling man with a medal around his neck. He had a sled under one arm and was using his other hand to raise a fountain pen high up in the air in a victory salute. Around him was a crowd frozen in mid-applause, their breaths cloudy in the winter air. I'm guessing this is Mr. Willow, I said. Yes, she said, leafing through the photographs. Here's another picture of him right before the race, with his wife holding his sled while he takes a sip of hot cider. I don't see his wife in the victory crowd, I said. Maybe she was preparing for the party. Look, here's another photograph of Mr. Willow, although you can only see his back. Then we can't be sure it's him, I said. It's the same sweater, Moxie said, and his sledding number is pinned to it. There, see? Number 4. It's printed on the sled, too. There's no number 4 on the sled when his wife's holding it. It's right there in the victory photo, see? I turned my eyes from Chase B. Willow taking a sip of cider to look again at Chase B. Willow winning the pen. He didn't look much like a criminal, but plenty of people grin after doing terrible things. Was the painting in a frame, I asked? It was leaning against a headboard, Moxie reminded me, so it was probably framed. I guess he could hide a framed painting under his sweater, I said, but it doesn't seem likely. His shoulders would look square. Moxie had found another picture, this one of a chalkboard someone had carried to the top of Homily Hill. The numbers 1 through 50 were chalked on it, but only 12 numbers had names after them. 12 sledders, she said, and 12 sledders only. See for yourself. I saw for myself. 1, Mrs. Williams. 2, Dr. Carlos. 3, Mr. Williams. 4, Mr. Willow. 5, Mrs. Summerover. 6, Dr. River. 7, Mr. No Leaf. 8, Dr. Bitten. 9, Mr. Crimson. 10, Mrs. Kling. 11, Mr. Paler. And 12, Mr. Loth. 2 people named Williams, I said. Yes, a married couple, Moxie said. You've met them, Snicket. They work over at the distillery. I wonder if they found it difficult to compete against each other, I said. I wouldn't think so. They competed in the contest for years when Mrs. Williams was still Miss Herman. Are there any other married couples on the list? Dr. Carlos is married to Mr. Loth, Moxie said. She kept her maiden name when she married him. Did Willow's wife do that? I don't think so. My mother referred to her as Mrs. Willow in the article. Do you know what she did for a living? Was she a doctor? She was a locksmith, Moxie said with a frown. What does that have to do with anything? It has to do with getting an innocent man out of jail, I said. The portrait of Gary Dorian may have been framed, but Chaseby Willow definitely was.